It was a warm evening in the city. The streets were alive with the sounds of people returning home, street vendors packing up their goods, and the occasional honk of cars driving past. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the buildings and the sidewalks. For many, it was just another ordinary evening, but for one young girl it would become a moment she would never forget. She was walking home from a community event, where she had been helping to set up decorations for a small local celebration. The air smelled faintly of food from nearby restaurants, mixed with the soft scent of flowers from someone's garden down the street. She felt tired but happy. It had been a long day of laughter and effort, of helping her neighbors and spending time with friends. She adjusted the strap of her backpack on her shoulder and looked around as she walked, noticing the familiar sights of her neighborhood, the small corner store, the graffiti on the brick walls, the old oak tree that had been there for decades. Her pace was slow, and she was lost in her thoughts when suddenly, a car pulled up beside her. The engine's rumble seemed louder than usual, and the windows of the vehicle were rolled down. 2 police officers stepped out. Their faces were serious, almost stern. She felt a knot of worry tighten in her stomach. She had seen police officers around her neighborhood before, and sometimes their presence made her feel safe, but tonight, something felt different. The air seemed tense, as if the quiet of the evening had been broken by an invisible alarm. "Hey, stop right there," one of the officers said. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for hesitation. The girl froze, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack. She had done nothing wrong, and yet her heart raced as she tried to understand why they were calling her over. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The officers exchanged a glance. There was a flicker of impatience in their eyes. "We need to check you," one of them said. His tone was firm, leaving no space for argument. The girl felt a wave of confusion and fear wash over her. She had heard stories from friends and neighbors about unfair treatment and harsh behavior, but she had never imagined herself in such a situation. She took a small step back, hoping to show she was not resisting. She tried to explain, "I'm just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong," but her words seemed to vanish into the air. One of the officers stepped closer, and she instinctively tried to move away. Then, without warning, the officer reached for the hem of her skirt. The suddenness of the action froze her in place. She felt her cheeks burn with shock and embarrassment. She couldn't believe what was happening. Around her, the neighborhood seemed to pause. A few neighbors had stopped their own routines to watch. Some whispered to each other, unable to fully understand the scene unfolding before them. Her friends, who had been a few steps behind, gasped. One of them took out a phone and began recording, their hands shaking. Another called out, trying to intervene, but the officers ignored the calls. The girl's mind raced. She tried to pull her skirt back down, tried to speak, tried to make them stop, but the officers were determined. It was as if they had decided without reason that she needed to be humiliated. The girl felt a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. Her voice trembled as she said, "Please stop. You don't understand who I am." But the officers did not pause. They seemed to act on routine, blind to the fear in her eyes and the murmurs of the people around them. Time felt strange. Each second stretched heavy with tension. She could hear the distant sound of traffic, the quiet hum of the city, but it all felt far away, as if she were trapped in a bubble of disbelief. She thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. The officers were blocking her path, their presence looming over her. She felt small, vulnerable, and powerless in a way she had never experienced before. Finally, one of the officers spoke again, his voice almost casual. "Just cooperate. It will be over soon." The words did little to soothe her fear. She realized that their idea of cooperation did not include her dignity or respect. The sense of injustice hit her like a wave. She had always been taught to respect authority, to follow rules, to be polite and kind, but none of those lessons seemed to matter here. Around her, people began to gather. A man walking his dog stopped and looked on with concern. A woman pushing a stroller whispered to another passerby, shaking her head in disbelief. The community was awake now, alert to what was happening on their streets, and the girl could feel their eyes on her. She drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She realized that in that moment her fear was shared by others. Their silent support, even without words, gave her a small spark of strength. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She wondered why the officers were treating her this way, why they couldn't see her as just a young girl walking home, why they couldn't see her as a person with feelings, a person who deserved respect. The unfairness of it was almost unbearable. Her thoughts flicked to her family, who were probably expecting her home by now. She imagined their worry, and it made her feel even more vulnerable. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but it was joined by a determination. She would not let this moment define her. She would not let this humiliation take away her sense of self. Even as the officers acted, she tried to keep her posture steady, her voice calm, her eyes meeting theirs with courage. She didn't know if it would make a difference, but it was the only control she had. The officers, still unaware of who she was, finally pulled back slightly, as if considering their next move. The girl's friends continued recording, capturing every second. The hum of whispers from the neighborhood grew louder. People began to murmur their disapproval, their voices mixing with the soft sounds of the evening. The officers glanced around, sensing the change in energy, but they had no idea how much attention they were attracting, how many eyes were watching, how many people would remember this moment. The girl stood there, trembling slightly but resolute. She had been shocked into silence at first, but now she found a quiet strength. She reminded herself that she was not alone, that her community was witnessing the injustice and that the truth mattered. Even in fear, she understood that her story was bigger than just this street, this evening, this encounter. It was then, in that tense silence, that someone finally spoke out. A neighbor stepped forward, voice firm, demanding the officers stop. The girl could feel the tension in the air shift slightly. The officers hesitated, their authority challenged not by her words alone, but by the growing presence of witnesses. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that justice might come, that someone would see the wrong and recognize the right. But the night was far from over. The officers still had no idea who they were dealing with, and the girl still faced a long path ahead, one that would test her courage, her patience, and her resilience. She knew that this moment would change her, shape her, and perhaps in ways she could not yet imagine, make her a voice for others who had been treated unfairly. As the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the pavement, she took a deep breath. The street was no longer just a familiar path home. It had become a place where fear, courage, and injustice collided. She could feel the eyes of her community upon her, and that gave her a strange sense of strength. She would carry this night with her, not as a memory of shame, but as a testament to the challenges she faced and the bravery she could summon. The city continued its rhythm, unaware of the story unfolding in a small corner of its streets. But for the girl, the evening would never be ordinary again. It was the beginning of something much larger, a story that would reach beyond the sidewalks and homes of her neighborhood, a story that would challenge authority, demand accountability, and reveal truths that could no longer be ignored. And so, she stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing, yet filled with a quiet determination. She did not yet know the full impact of what had happened, but she knew one thing: she would not be silenced. This was just the first chapter of a story that would shake a community, expose injustice, and ultimately change the way people saw power, courage, and the strength of one young girl facing a moment she never asked for, but would never forget. The evening air still held a quiet tension as the girl tried to gather herself. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her breath came in uneven bursts. Her friends stood nearby, glancing at her with worry and anger in their eyes. They couldn't believe what had just happened. Even after the officers stepped back, the weight of humiliation hung heavily over her. The street, which had seemed ordinary only moments ago, now felt strange and sharp, almost unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed longer, every passing car louder, and every footstep on the pavement a reminder of what had just occurred. Her friends surrounded her, their voices hushed but urgent. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, eyes wide. The girl nodded slowly, though inside she felt shaken. She wanted to cry, but she also wanted to hold herself together. She had been taught to stay composed even in difficult situations, but this felt different. It was not just an ordinary challenge. It was a personal violation, one that left her unsure of how to respond. The girl realized that this moment was not just hers alone. The people around her, the neighbors, the friends, even the strangers on the street, had all witnessed what happened. Some of them had phones out recording the scene. She knew even if she didn't yet fully understand that these recordings could become evidence, a way for her voice to be heard when the officers tried to dismiss the incident. That thought gave her a small spark of hope amidst the fear and embarrassment. Meanwhile, the officers stood by, their expressions unreadable. They appeared calm, almost indifferent, but the girl could sense a subtle shift in their demeanor. It was as if they were suddenly aware that the street was no longer empty, that there were witnesses, that their actions were no longer private. One of them muttered something to the other, their conversation low and hurried. The girl didn't catch the words, but she could feel the change in their posture, a faint hesitation that had not been there before. The girl took a cautious step backward, putting some distance between herself and the officers. She wanted to leave, to escape the scene, but fear still held her in place. What if they followed her? What if they tried to stop her again? Her mind raced with questions she could not answer. She looked at her friends, who were equally uncertain, trying to find courage in each other's presence. A neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the community for decades, finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady and calm, but it carried authority. "That's enough," she said. "You have no right to treat her this way." The officers glanced at her, momentarily surprised by the intervention. The girl felt a surge of relief. Even a small act of support from someone in her community mattered. It reminded her that she was not completely alone in facing this injustice. Other neighbors began murmuring their agreement. One man shook his head, his voice rising slightly as he said, "What are you doing? This is wrong." The whispers grew into louder expressions of disapproval, and soon a small crowd had formed on the sidewalk. The girl's fear mingled with a strange sense of empowerment. She realized that people were paying attention, that her story might reach beyond this street. Beyond these moments, her friends encouraged her to speak, to tell the officers that what they were doing was not acceptable. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. "I am just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong. Please stop this." Her words were simple, honest, and clear. She did not yell or scream, but there was firmness in her tone that could not be ignored. The officers shifted uneasily. One of them tried to respond, but his voice faltered as the girl continued speaking. Her calm, composed words contrasted sharply with the aggression of the moment, and it seemed to catch them off guard. The girl could sense that their authority, once absolute, was being questioned, not just by her but by the community around her. The recordings continued, capturing every second of the interaction. Each phone camera, each phone voice became a witness. The girl felt a strange reassurance in that. Even though she had been powerless in the moment, she realized that power could take other forms. Her story, her experience could be preserved, shared, and amplified. It could no longer be erased or ignored. The officers exchanged glances, the tension between them now visible. They seemed to debate silently about what to do next. Finally, one of them spoke, his tone sharper than before. "Move along. Nothing to see here." The words felt hollow, almost an attempt to regain control over a situation that was slipping from their grasp. The girl, however, did not move immediately. She knew that leaving too quickly might feel like surrender, as if she were allowing the incident to be brushed aside. Instead, she stood her ground, keeping her eyes forward, acknowledging the people around her with quiet dignity. She realized that courage was not just about confronting the officers. It was also about maintaining her sense of self in a moment designed to humiliate her. The street had become a stage, and her composure was her silent protest. Some members of the small crowd began speaking louder, voicing their disapproval more openly. "This is not right," someone shouted. "You can't treat a child like this." The girl felt a mix of relief and worry. Relief because support was growing, and worry because she knew that speaking out could escalate tensions. Yet she understood that silence could not protect her dignity. Her mind wandered briefly to her family. They would want to know what happened. They would be worried, perhaps even angry, but she knew they would also be proud of her courage. The thought strengthened her resolve. She realized that this incident, as unfair and shocking as it was, could become something larger, a moment of learning and reflection for the community. The officers, sensing that the crowd's attention had shifted and that their actions were no longer private, seemed to lose some of their earlier confidence. They muttered to each other, their movements slightly less assertive. The girl's heart pounded, but she felt a small measure of relief. She had stood her ground, she had spoken up. Even if the officers had tried to humiliate her, she had refused to let fear completely control her actions. At that moment, a neighbor offered the girl a hand, guiding her slightly away from the immediate tension. She accepted it, grateful for the support, but her eyes never left the officers. She wanted to make sure that they understood she was not just another person on the street. She had a name and identity, and she deserved to be treated with respect. The officers, after a moment of hesitation, finally got back into their car. The engine roared to life and the vehicle drove away, leaving behind a quiet but visibly unsettled street. The girl exhaled deeply, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering fear. She had survived the encounter, but the emotional impact was only beginning to settle in. Her friends gathered around her, offering comforting words, hugs, and reassurance. They walked with her a short distance, making sure she felt safe. The neighborhood once again returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy had shifted. The incident had left a mark, not just on the girl but on everyone who witnessed it. It had sparked conversations, questions, and emotions that would not easily be forgotten. Later that evening, as the girl finally reached the safety of her home, she sat quietly on her bed, reflecting on what had happened. She thought about the officers, the crowd, her friends, and the neighbors who had spoken up. She realized that fear had been only one part of the story. There had also been courage, support, and the power of community. She had faced a moment designed to humiliate her, and while it had shaken her, it had also revealed a strength she did not know she had. Her mind began to consider the wider implications. What if others had not been there to witness? What if no one had recorded the incident? She felt a mixture of gratitude and determination. Gratitude for the people who had stood by her, and determination to ensure that her story, and the stories of others who faced similar injustices, could not be silenced. The night stretched on and the city settled into quiet darkness. The girl lay awake, thinking about the events of the evening, replaying moments in her mind. She thought about the officers, their actions, and the lessons she could take from the experience. She understood that fear could be transformed into awareness, and that even in moments of vulnerability, one could find courage and strength. As sleep finally began to claim her, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not allow this incident to define her. She would not let humiliation take away her voice or her dignity, and she would find a way to ensure that what happened on that street would be seen, heard, and remembered, not just as a story of fear, but as a story of courage, resilience, and the quiet power of standing up for oneself, even when it feels impossible. That evening had changed her, but it had also prepared her for what was coming next. The incident was no longer just a private fear. It was a story that would ripple outward, touching her family, her community, and eventually the larger world. And as she drifted into sleep, she carried with her a small, steady flame of hope. A hope that justice, truth, and accountability could still be found, even in the darkest and most unexpected moments. The next morning, the city was buzzing with energy, but the girl's mind was still caught in the events of the previous evening. She woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. Messages, notifications, and missed calls flooded her screen. Her friends had shared the recordings of the incident online, and the response was immediate and intense. She could feel the weight of attention pressing down on her, both overwhelming and strangely empowering. Her parents, concerned and furious, had already seen the videos. They sat her down, their expressions a mix of worry and pride. Her father's hand rested gently on hers, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, not wanting to make her relive the trauma but needing to know she was safe. She nodded, swallowing hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm okay," she whispered, though the words barely captured the storm of feelings inside her. The girl's mother took a deep breath and pulled her into a hug. "You are so brave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't let fear control you. You stood up even when it was hard. That matters." The girl clung to her parents, finding comfort in their presence. She realized that even though the incident had shaken her, she was not alone. Her family, her friends, and even her community were standing with her. By mid-morning, the story had started spreading beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the recordings and social media was alive with outrage. People shared the videos, expressing anger and disbelief at the officers' behavior. Comments poured in from strangers, some offering support, others demanding accountability. The girl watched the reactions unfold, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and determination. She understood that her private fear had become a public story, and now it had the power to spark change. Her friends stayed close, helping her navigate the sudden attention. They reminded her to take breaks from her phone, to breathe, and to focus on what she could control. It was overwhelming, but their presence made it manageable. Even so, she could not ignore the thought that the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. She had not revealed her full identity, and the power imbalance from the previous night still lingered in her mind. Around noon, the city council office called. The girl's parents answered, and within moments they were informed that the mayor had been made aware of the incident. The realization hit the girl like a jolt. The officers had unknowingly targeted the mayor's own daughter. Her heart pounded as she thought about what this could mean. The story had shifted overnight from a local incident to a high-profile situation that would demand attention at the highest levels. The mayor's office moved quickly, issuing a statement condemning the actions of the officers and promising a full investigation. The girl and her family were assured that steps would be taken to protect her and to ensure accountability. The community's support grew stronger as local leaders and advocates began reaching out, offering assistance and expressing solidarity. The girl felt a cautious sense of relief. The fear of the previous evening still lingered, but now it was accompanied by a sense that justice might be possible. As the day went on, reporters and journalists began arriving at the family's neighborhood. They wanted to interview witnesses, capture reactions, and understand the context of the incident. The girl's friends, who had been present the night before, shared what they had seen, describing the officers' actions and the immediate response from the community. The girl listened quietly, feeling the story grow larger and more public than she had ever imagined. Meanwhile, the officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. News outlets reported that the police department had begun an internal review, looking into both the conduct of the officers and the broader issues of accountability within the force. The girl realized that what had begun as a single, personal experience was now part of a larger conversation about justice, fairness, and the responsibilities of those in positions of power. Throughout the day, the girl's emotions were a mixture of relief, anxiety, and resolve. She thought about the young people in her neighborhood who might have been too afraid to speak out, the families who had witnessed injustice and felt powerless, and the countless others whose voices often went unheard. She understood in a deep and personal way the importance of courage. Standing up in the moment had been terrifying, but it had also been necessary. By evening, the community had organized a small gathering outside the neighborhood park. People came together to express support, share their experiences, and stand in solidarity with the girl. Signs were held high, messages of empowerment were shouted, and the sense of collective strength was palpable. The girl watched from a safe distance, her heart swelling with gratitude. She realized that her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, everyone who had felt fear in the face of injustice, and everyone who had the courage to stand up for what was right. Her parents stayed close, ensuring she felt safe amidst the growing attention. They encouraged her to speak if she wanted, but also to step back and rest when it became too much. She understood that her voice mattered, but so did her well-being. In quiet moments, she reflected on the previous night, on the fear, the humiliation, and the courage she had found within herself. The memory was still painful, but it was no longer entirely consuming. She had reclaimed some of her power simply by being present, by speaking, and by allowing her story to be seen. As the crowd dispersed and the neighborhood returned to its evening rhythm, the girl and her friends walked home together. They spoke softly, sharing thoughts about what had happened, what they had witnessed, and what might come next. The girl felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. She knew that the days ahead would be filled with questions, with scrutiny, and with challenges. But she also knew that she had already taken the first steps toward asserting her voice and her dignity. Later that night, as the city lights glimmered outside her window, the girl sat quietly with her parents. They discussed the next steps, how to protect her privacy while still ensuring the story was heard, and what she wanted to do moving forward. She realized that the incident had changed her perspective on authority, on justice, and on the importance of speaking out. Fear had been a part of the experience, but it had not been the whole story. Courage, community, and resilience were equally present. and they would guide her in the days ahead. Even as sleep began to pull at her, the girl could not stop thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. The officers had acted carelessly and aggressively, unaware of who they were confronting. The community had responded with support and outrage, showing that collective action could hold power accountable. The story had already begun to inspire conversations, to challenge assumptions, and to demand change. The girl felt a quiet sense of responsibility. She had become, in a way, a symbol of resilience and courage, and she could not ignore the opportunity to make a difference. In the following days, the news continued to cover the story. Interviews with neighbors, recordings from witnesses, and social media posts kept the conversation alive. The girl's experience became a catalyst for broader discussions about police conduct, accountability, and respect for young people in the community. She saw her own fear transformed into awareness, understanding that her story could help others recognize the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how small or large the moment might seem. The girl also reflected on her own feelings: fear, anger, embarrassment, but also pride. She had faced a moment that could have silenced her, yet she had chosen to respond with courage and composure. That choice, she realized, was the beginning of reclaiming her sense of agency. She had been powerless in some ways, but she had also exercised her power in ways that mattered. Her parents continued to support her, helping her navigate the media attention, the questions from friends and neighbors, and the growing awareness of the incident beyond their neighborhood. They reminded her to stay grounded, to focus on what she could control, and to find balance amidst the whirlwind. The girl felt a sense of calm in their guidance, understanding that she did not have to face everything alone. By the end of the week, the story had reached the mayor himself. The girl's identity as his daughter had been revealed, and the city's attention intensified. Officials met with the family, promising a thorough investigation and immediate steps to address the misconduct of the officers. The girl, while still processing the shock and fear of the initial encounter, realized that her story had grown far beyond her expectations. It had become a turning point, a moment that demanded accountability and reflection from those in power. Even in private moments, she could not ignore the impact of the previous night. The fear she had felt, the humiliation she had endured, and the courage she had found would remain with her, but so would the support, the community, and the growing awareness that her experience could inspire change. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And in those moments she had acted in ways that mattered, not just for herself, but for everyone who might face similar injustices. As she lay in bed, reflecting on the events, the girl felt a sense of quiet determination. The officer's actions had spared. The next morning, the girl woke up feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was still shaken by what had happened the night before, but there was also a small flicker of strength inside her. She lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in her mind. The fear, the embarrassment, and the shock were still there, but she also remembered the moments when she had spoken up, the few steps she had taken to reclaim some control. She clutched her pillow tightly, thinking about how quickly a regular evening had turned into a moment that could change her life. Her phone started buzzing incessantly. Messages and notifications filled the screen. Her friends had shared the videos they had recorded during the incident, and people were reacting. The girl's stomach tightened as she scrolled through the comments. Some were filled with anger at the officers, some with support for her, and others with disbelief that something like this could happen at all. She felt overwhelmed. She had never imagined that her private experience could reach so many people. But she also felt a quiet hope that her story might help others who had faced similar injustices. Her parents quickly noticed the messages and videos. They were furious and deeply concerned. Her father pulled her close and asked softly, "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I'm okay," she said, though the words felt small compared to the storm of emotions inside her. Her mother held her hand tightly and said, "You are brave. You did what was right. You stayed calm and stood up for yourself." The girl felt comforted by their support. In that moment, she realized that although the incident had left her feeling powerless, she was surrounded by people who cared deeply about her safety and dignity. By mid-morning, the story had begun spreading. The videos were shared across social media, and local news outlets started covering the incident. People were outraged. Many expressed anger at the officer's behavior and sympathy for the girl. The comments reflected a shared disbelief that such an act could happen in the middle of a neighborhood, in front of witnesses. The girl felt a mix of fear and relief. She had faced humiliation, yet now her voice was being amplified by others. Her experience was no longer private, and she realized that might be a chance to bring about change. Her friends stayed close to her throughout the day. They reassured her, helped her read the news without becoming overwhelmed, and reminded her to breathe when she felt anxious. Despite their support, she could not stop thinking about the officers. She wondered if they even realized who they had confronted. She had not told them her full identity during the incident, and it was clear that their assumptions had caused them to act carelessly and arrogantly. By early afternoon, the mayor's office contacted her parents. The girl's identity had been discovered, and the revelation added a whole new layer of seriousness to the situation. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about neighborhood police misconduct. It was a high-profile case. The mayor's office promised that the incident would be thoroughly investigated, and the officers involved would be held accountable. The girl felt a mixture of apprehension and relief. She knew that the attention could be overwhelming, but she also understood that it could lead to justice, something that had seemed uncertain the night before. As the day continued, journalists began arriving in the neighborhood. They spoke with witnesses and friends who had been present, capturing their accounts of the incident. Each story, each retelling added clarity and depth to what had happened. The girl listened quietly, feeling both exposed and supported. She understood that the community's collective voice was stronger than her own alone. Together, they were creating a record of events that could not easily be ignored or erased. Meanwhile, the officers involved had been placed on administrative leave. The police department launched an internal investigation into their conduct, examining not only this incident, but also any prior complaints that might exist. The girl realized that what had started as a terrifying personal experience was now part of a larger conversation about accountability, respect, and proper behavior within the police force. She felt the weight of responsibility in a new way. Her experience was now more than just her own. It had the potential to shape discussions and influence decisions that affected her entire community. Throughout the day, the girl reflected on the previous night. Fear had been overwhelming, and yet she had found moments of courage. She remembered standing her ground, speaking up and holding herself together even when everything inside her wanted to crumble. She realized that courage did not mean the absence of fear. It meant taking action despite it. That understanding gave her a strange sense of calm. She was beginning to see herself not just as a victim, but as someone who could influence change. As evening approached, the community began to gather. People came together outside the local park, bringing signs, speaking words of encouragement, and showing solidarity. The girl watched from a distance, her heart swelling with gratitude. She understood that her story had inspired others to act, to stand up against wrongdoing and to make their voices heard. The community's presence reminded her that she was not alone, and that collective action could be powerful. Her parents stayed close, guiding her through the growing attention. They helped her speak to reporters when necessary, ensured that her privacy was respected, and provided comfort during quieter moments. She began to understand the importance of balancing visibility with safety. While her story needed to be told, she also needed space to process her own emotions and experiences. Late in the evening, the girl reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. The officers had assumed they could act without consequences, but the community's response had challenged that notion. Witnesses, friends, neighbors, and now the wider public had amplified her story. She realized that power could be held accountable, and that fear could be transformed into awareness and action. Her experience, though painful, was now a catalyst for reflection and change. She also thought about the people who might face similar situations in the future. Children and young people in her neighborhood and beyond, who might feel powerless when confronted by authority. She wanted them to know that speaking up, seeking support, and holding on to dignity mattered. She recognized that her courage could serve as an example, showing that one voice, when supported by others, could make a difference. The girl continued to watch the news and social media coverage, seeing her story expand beyond the city. People were talking about respect, accountability, and proper conduct. Her experience had sparked conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces. She felt a quiet pride even amidst lingering fear. that her ordeal could now be part of a larger movement toward awareness and change. By the end of the day, the mayor's office had begun coordinating with the police department to ensure that the investigation was thorough and fair. Steps were taken to provide the girl and her family with support, protection, and guidance. The officers involved faced scrutiny, and their future in the force became uncertain. The girl realized that her fear from the night before had transformed into hope that justice could be achieved and that accountability was possible. Even as the city settled into nighttime calm, her mind remained active. She thought about the strength she had discovered in herself, the support she had received, and the responsibilities that now rested on her shoulders. She understood that the incident had changed her perspective, teaching her about courage, resilience, and the importance of speaking out against injustice. Fear had been part of the experience, but it no longer defined her. The girl lay in bed reflecting on everything that had happened. The humiliation and shock of the previous night still lingered, but they were now accompanied by a sense of empowerment. She had been seen, her voice had been heard, and her experience had sparked action. She understood that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and persistent. That realization gave her strength for the days to come. Her parents remained by her side, offering guidance, comfort, and reassurance. They reminded her that while her story was public, she could still control how she engaged with it. They encouraged her to focus on what she could influence, to maintain her well-being, and to take pride in the courage she had shown. The girl absorbed their advice, feeling grounded in the knowledge that she was supported, protected, and valued. As she drifted toward sleep, the girl thought about the city outside her window, the streets she had walked, and the people who had witnessed her experience. She realized that while the incident had been frightening and unfair, it had also illuminated the power of community, the importance of standing up, and the strength that could be found even in moments of vulnerability. She understood that her story had grown beyond her own experience, becoming a source of awareness, inspiration, and potential change. She resolved to continue reflecting, learning, and speaking up when necessary. The officer's actions had revealed a serious problem, but her response and the response of her community had shown that accountability was possible. Fear had been present, but courage had emerged stronger. She understood that her story was no longer just about one night. It was about justice, dignity, and the impact one person could have when supported by a community. The following morning, the city woke to a new level of awareness about what had happened the night before. News outlets were filled with reports about the incident. Social media posts had gone viral, and the girl's story had captured the attention of thousands of people. Everyone seemed to be talking about it. Friends, neighbors, strangers, even people in other cities. The girl, sitting quietly at the breakfast table with her parents, felt a mix of emotions: fear, pride, anger, and determination all swirling together. Her father poured a cup of tea, his hands trembling slightly, and said, "The attention is going to be intense today. Are you ready for it?" She nodded, swallowing hard, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "I think so," she said, "but I don't know what to expect." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've been brave already," she said. "Now people are listening, and that matters. That's the important part." The girl drew in a deep breath, letting the words sink in. Courage, she realized, wasn't about not being scared. It was about facing fear, even when your heart is racing. By mid-morning, the community had begun to organize. People started gathering outside the neighborhood park, carrying signs and banners. They wanted to show support for the girl and her family, to speak out against the officer's actions, and to demand justice. She watched the videos and photos shared online, seeing faces of neighbors, friends, and even strangers holding signs that read messages like, "Respect everyone" and "Justice for all." She felt a strange mix of pride and humility. She had never imagined that her story would inspire so many people to take action. At the same time, city leaders were responding. The mayor's office released an official statement condemning the behavior of the officers and promising a thorough investigation. Police officials were under pressure from the community, from social media, and from journalists. Administrative leave had already been imposed on the 2 officers involved, and an internal review was being launched. The girl realized that her story was not just a personal experience anymore. It had become part of a larger conversation about accountability, respect, and justice in the city. Throughout the day, The girl's phone kept buzzing with notifications. Messages of support arrived from friends, relatives, and even strangers who had seen her story online. Some messages were short, simple words of encouragement. "Stay strong. You are brave. We support you." Others were longer, filled with reflections about fairness, dignity, and the importance of standing up to injustice. She read each one carefully, feeling the warmth and solidarity of people she had never met. Even though fear and anxiety lingered, these messages reminded her that she was not alone. The girl's friends remained a constant source of support. They helped her navigate interviews, offered advice on what to say, and reminded her to take breaks when the attention became overwhelming. At times, the spotlight felt like too much. Cameras, reporters, and curious neighbors all wanted answers, perspectives, and reactions. But her friends' presence grounded her. They reminded her that it was okay to step back, to breathe, and to focus on her own feelings rather than the public's expectations. As the day went on, the community gathering grew larger. People of all ages joined in, bringing homemade signs, chanting supportive messages, and speaking passionately about justice and accountability. The girl watched from a safe distance, her heart swelling with gratitude. She saw teachers, shop owners, and even people she had never met standing together for the same cause. The energy was both humbling and empowering. She realized that one small moment, which had felt so personal and isolating, had sparked a larger movement of awareness and solidarity. Journalists interviewed witnesses who had recorded the incident. Their accounts were detailed, describing not only what the officers had done but also the reactions of the community at the time. The girl listened quietly to these retellings, realizing that her courage had inspired others to speak out. People were sharing their own stories of fear, injustice, and resilience. She understood in a deep and personal way that individual experiences could connect to broader patterns, and that speaking out could create meaningful change. Meanwhile, the officers involved faced growing scrutiny. Their names and actions were being discussed in city meetings, on social media, and in news reports. Administrative leave meant they could no longer act without oversight, but the investigation promised that accountability would not be delayed. The girl thought about the fear she had felt the night before, and realized that justice was beginning to take shape. Her experience had forced the system to respond, to recognize wrongdoing, and to consider the impact of actions that might otherwise have been ignored. By evening, the public outcry had grown even stronger. Community leaders, activists, and local organizations joined in, organizing forums and discussions about policing, respect, and accountability. The girl's story became a touchpoint for conversations about fairness and dignity. People talked not only about the specific incident, but also about broader concerns regarding authority, trust, and the responsibility of those in power. The girl understood that her experience, while deeply personal, had become a symbol of courage and accountability for the wider community. Even in private moments, she could not escape the weight of what had happened. The incident had shaken her deeply, but it had also revealed a strength she hadn't fully realized before. Fear and anger were still present, but now they were joined by clarity and determination. She began to understand that her story mattered not just for herself, but for everyone who might face similar situations in the future. Courage, she realized, was not just about standing up once. It was about continuing to act, speak, and insist on fairness even when it was difficult. Her parents continued to guide and support her throughout the day. They helped her balance public attention with personal reflection, reminding her that her well-being was just as important as the message her story conveyed. They encouraged her to rest when needed, to speak when she felt ready, and to trust in the strength of her own voice. She felt a deep sense of comfort in their presence, knowing that whatever happened next, she was not alone. As night fell, the city streets began to quiet, but the energy from the public gathering lingered. People had dispersed, but the conversations and messages continued to spread online and throughout neighborhoods. The girl sat by her window, watching the lights of the city twinkle, and thought about the journey that had begun only a few days ago. The fear she had experienced was still vivid, but it was now balanced by hope, determination, and a sense of purpose. She reflected on the courage of her friends, the support of her neighbors, and the unity of the community. She realized that even small actions, recording a video, speaking up, standing in solidarity, could create a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could anticipate. Her story had sparked awareness, accountability, and conversation. It had turned fear into action and humiliation into a platform for change. The girl also thought about the officers and the consequences they were beginning to face. She knew that accountability was not just about punishment. It was about learning, reflection, and the recognition of the harm caused by careless actions. Her experience had highlighted the importance of respect, empathy, and responsibility for those in positions of power. The girl felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her courage and her voice had contributed to this process, even in a small way. Before going to bed, she reviewed the messages of support once more. She read words of encouragement, shared experiences and reflections from people all over the city. Each message reminded her that she was part of a larger community, one that valued justice, dignity, and the courage to speak out. She felt a deep sense of connection to these people, many of whom she had never met. The girl realized that her story was not only her own, it belonged to anyone who had ever faced fear, unfairness, or humiliation. As she drifted off to sleep, the girl thought about the future. She knew the investigation would continue, that there would be questions, scrutiny, and challenges ahead. But she also knew that she had already taken the first steps toward ensuring her story would be heard, and that accountability would be demanded. Her courage, resilience, and the support of those around her would guide her through the days to come. The city outside was quiet, but the impact of her experience would continue to echo. Her story had sparked public conversation, inspired community action, and reminded everyone that even a single moment of injustice could be challenged. Fear and vulnerability had been present, but so had courage, strength, and the unwavering support of people who believed in fairness. The girl understood that her journey was far from over. There would be more conversations, more decisions, and more moments when her courage would be tested. But she felt ready, strengthened by the experience and the knowledge that she was not alone. Her story had already made a difference, and she was determined to ensure that it would continue to do so. Even as she closed her eyes, she felt a quiet determination settle within her. The officers' actions had revealed a serious problem, but the response of the community, the media, and her own courage had shown that accountability was possible. Fear had been real, but it had not controlled her. She had faced a moment of injustice, and in doing so, she had helped Grimware. The weeks that followed were quieter but no less significant. The girl had grown accustomed to the changes in her life, though the memory of that evening remained vivid. She woke up each morning aware that the incident had changed her world and her perspective. Life seemed ordinary on the surface, but underneath, she felt a new sense of strength, confidence, and responsibility. Her parents were proud of how she had handled everything. They continued to offer support and guidance, but now they also encouraged her to focus on herself, her studies, her friendships, and her dreams. "You have faced something very difficult," her mother said one morning, "and you came through it. Now it is time to take care of yourself too." The girl nodded, realizing that healing and growth were just as important as accountability and justice. At school, life gradually returned to its routines, but the conversations had shifted. Teachers, classmates, and even younger students spoke more openly about respect, fairness, and courage. The girl noticed that her peers were more aware of how their words and actions could affect others. Some of them shared their own stories, drawing strength from the example she had set. It was a quiet, almost subtle change, but the girl recognized it as a ripple effect of what had happened. Her courage had inspired dialogue and reflection that went beyond her own experience. Community events continued as well. Neighborhood groups organized meetings, workshops, and forums that focused on respect, accountability, and civic engagement. The girl sometimes attended these gatherings with her parents, not as a central figure, but as a participant who had first-hand experience. She listened to stories from other young people who had faced unfair treatment, and she offered encouragement where she could. Each conversation strengthened her understanding of the importance of community, empathy, and collective action. The investigation into the officers had concluded by this time. The disciplinary actions were made public. Retraining, suspensions, and reviews of conduct were enforced, and the officers were held accountable for their actions. The girl felt a quiet sense of relief and validation. The process had been long and sometimes exhausting, but justice had been served. She realized that accountability was not only about punishment, It was about learning, correction, and creating safer environments for everyone. Her parents continued to guide her through the aftermath. They reminded her to reflect on what had happened, to acknowledge her feelings, and to celebrate the strength she had shown. "You faced fear and stood your ground," her father said one evening. "That is something no one can take away from you." The girl felt warmth and pride as she listened. She understood that true courage was not always visible. It could be quiet, steady, and resilient, growing stronger with time. Social media and news outlets gradually shifted focus to the broader lessons from the incident. Editorials discussed the importance of accountability in all levels of authority, while community leaders emphasized programs for youth empowerment and civic education. The girl noticed that her story was being used as an example of how courage, honesty, and perseverance could lead to meaningful change. She felt a sense of purpose knowing that her experience could inspire and guide others, even as she worked to move forward with her own life. The girl also reflected on her personal growth. She had faced an event that could have left her feeling powerless, humiliated, or fearful for a long time. Instead, she found strength in speaking up, seeking support, and remaining calm under pressure. She had learned to navigate fear, to assert herself, and to understand the power of community solidarity. These lessons stayed with her, shaping her perspective on relationships, trust, and responsibility. Her friendships deepened during this time. The friends who had stood by her from the beginning remained close, and she realized how important it was to have people who believed in her. They laughed together, shared schoolwork, and supported one another in ordinary ways. These moments reminded her that life continued beyond the incident, and that ordinary joys and routines could coexist with lessons learned from extraordinary experiences. The girl also began to think about the future. She felt motivated to use her voice for positive change. Discussions with her parents and community members opened her eyes to possibilities, participating in youth councils, joining community organizations, and advocating for fairness and accountability. She realized that courage was not a one-time event. It was a habit, a way of living, and a commitment to stand for what was right even when it was difficult. Over time, the neighborhood and city began to reflect the lessons learned. Police officers participated in ongoing training programs emphasizing respect, communication, and community engagement. Residents became more involved in civic initiatives, creating a sense of shared responsibility and trust. The girl felt a quiet satisfaction in observing these changes. Her story had been a catalyst, showing that one voice, combined with courage and support, could spark meaningful transformation. Private moments, however, remained important. The girl spent evenings reading, reflecting, and journaling. She wrote about her feelings, her fears, and her hopes for the future. Writing helped her process what had happened and allowed her to capture her personal growth. She realized that reflection was an essential part of courage. It was not only about facing fear, but also about understanding it, learning from it, and using that understanding to guide future actions. Her parents continued to emphasize balance. They encouraged her to enjoy life, pursue hobbies, and nurture friendships, while also remaining aware of the impact her story could have on the community. "You have shown strength beyond your years," her mother said. "Now it is time to nurture yourself too." The girl absorbed this advice, recognizing that true resilience involved caring for oneself as much as it involved facing challenges. Community recognition continued in subtle ways. Teachers, neighbors, and friends acknowledged her courage, often in private conversations rather than public displays. The girl appreciated these gestures, understanding that recognition did not have to be loud to be meaningful. It reinforced her sense of self-worth and reminded her that courage could be quietly influential, shaping lives without needing constant attention. As months passed, the girl reflected on the growth she had experienced. Fear, embarrassment, and anxiety had once dominated her thoughts, but they had been tempered by resilience, awareness, and the support of her family and community. She realized that courage was not an abstract quality. It was a daily practice demonstrated in both ordinary and extraordinary moments. Each time she faced challenges, she remembered how she had handled the incident, drawing strength from that experience. The girl also thought about the power of storytelling. Sharing her experience had allowed others to understand, empathize, and act. She recognized that stories could inspire change, educate communities, and challenge harmful behaviors. Her own story, painful as it had contributed to a broader awareness about respect, accountability, and the responsibilities of authority figures. She felt a quiet pride in knowing that her courage had created opportunities for others to learn and grow. During this time, her friendships, school life, and community involvement flourished. She balanced ordinary activities with the awareness that her experience had lasting significance. She spoke with younger students, sharing lessons about courage and self-respect. She participated in neighborhood initiatives and helped organize discussions about safety and accountability. Through these actions, she realized that her role extended beyond herself. Her experience had become a resource for others, and she had the power to make a positive impact. Her parents remained a constant source of guidance. They reminded her that even as the public attention faded, the lessons learned would stay with her. "Your story will always be part of who you are," her father said, "but so will your growth, your courage, and your choices moving forward." The girl nodded, feeling the truth of these words. She understood that her experience was not a burden to carry, but a foundation to build upon. As she reflected on the month since the incident, the girl realized how far she had come. She had faced fear, humiliation, and uncertainty, yet she had emerged stronger, more aware, and more determined. The incident had changed her, but it had not defined her. Instead, it had taught her the value of courage, community, and personal integrity. She understood that her story would continue to influence her life and the lives of others, guiding decisions, shaping actions, and inspiring resilience. By the time the city had implemented new programs for training, accountability, and youth engagement, the girl felt a sense of closure. The officers had been held accountable, the community had grown stronger, and discussions about fairness and respect were ongoing. She knew that challenges would arise in the future, but she also knew that she had already faced a moment that demanded courage, and she had succeeded. That experience would remain with her, guiding her choices and strengthening her character. The girl continued to focus on her personal growth. She pursued her interests, spent time with friends, and engaged in activities that brought her joy and fulfillment. At the same time, she remained aware of the broader significance of her story. She knew that courage, resilience, and advocacy were not one-time actions. They were ways of living, guiding her in moments